This was a difficult list. Now we have our free space, but after that, it became weird because there are so many wide receivers in Ole Miss history.
You are Locked On Ole Miss, your daily podcast on the Ole Miss Rebels. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello, I'm Stephen Willis, a 10-year veteran of the national media and a former staff member in the Manning Center. I've seen some of these players come through, and we are going to look at the top 5 wide receivers. This is the way this works. Whenever I have guests on the show, they go 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and that is how we do their ranking. But I go the other direction. I go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, because usually 1 is a free space in Ole Miss lore whenever you're dealing with the top of everything going on. And the real discussion happens at 5 and 4 and 3 and those areas right there. So as it goes on, I want to save that little drama for later. So here we go. The top 5 wide receivers in Ole Miss history as per Stephen Willis. And that is, we'll start with A.J. Brown. This is a free space. A.J. Brown was the most dynamic wide receiver that Ole Miss has ever seen. He actually was unfortunate enough to play on some pretty bad football teams under the end of Hugh Freeze and the beginning of Matt Luke. But he was productive nonetheless. With his ball in his hand, he was as electric as he can get. He was big. He was physical. He could play in the slot. He could play on the outside. And he is the one that established Ole Miss's reputation of that jumbo type wide receivers post Laquan Treadwell, to where Ole Miss receivers being these big wide receivers became a thing. Number 2, Laquan Treadwell, the wide receiver that I don't want to say he started it all, but he definitely popularized it at Ole Miss, the jumbo big wide receivers. You have a situation under Bo Wallace and Chad Kelly that where they literally thought whenever they were in trouble, Laquan Treadwell is down there. The tip 6 that Quincy Adeboyo scored a touchdown on against Alabama was literally on one of those plays that bounced off a helmet. Laquan Treadwell before injury was outright dominant in the SEC, and he was on his way to being a top 5, top 10 pick in the NFL draft. It didn't work out for him. He got hurt. Auburn did that, and part of my hatred for all things Auburn comes from the fact of how that game happened and how they covered it and how they justified covering it that way. Talking about a player that severely hurt himself. And Laquan's had a 10-year NFL career, so don't hear me say that it completely derailed him, but he could have had an A.J. Brown-like NFL career as opposed to a journeyman. Laquan Treadwell was dominant on the first team that Ole Miss had to make the Sugar Bowl since Archie Manning, and part of their renaissance as well. Now, the third wide receiver, we got Dante Moncrief. And I put these 3 in the first segment for a reason, because these 3 are kind of free spaces to me. Dante Moncrief was, again, the jumbo physical wide receiver that over the last decade Ole Miss has become known for. Dante didn't really popularize it. He didn't really make it famous or anything like that. Dante just produced, and he fit the mold before Laquan Treadwell, before A.J. Brown, that made the big jumbo type wide receiver cool. We all remember Feed Moncrief and his 3 touchdowns against Jonathan Banks and Mississippi State in 2012. We remember him in the Music City Bowl in 2013 in his last game, scoring a touchdown against Georgia Tech. We remember him making big play after big play, like in Austin, Texas, against the Texas Longhorns, scoring a touchdown as well. Dante Moncrief was a really good wide receiver and was a gate opener to other receivers that followed him in this decade period. Now, when we come back, thanks for watching the Locked On Ole Miss podcast. When we come back, we will continue the top 5 list and get on with some maybe controversial type names that you have to think about. Good stuff, really good players. You can't really argue with them being included, But you might wonder, hey, where's this player? Where's that player? Because there's just simply so many wide receivers. But Gametime is the place to get NBA Finals tickets with killer last-minute deals, all-in prices, views from your seats, and their lowest price guarantee. Gametime takes the guesswork out of buying NBA tickets. They have views from every seat in the venue, even Vaught Hemingway. You can find out if you're trying to get into the Georgia game, which there's a lot of people that's going to try to get into the Georgia game. Gametime has it to where you can see the views from wherever the seats where you're getting in. Now, there's not a bad seat in Vaught Hemingway, but this will give you an idea of what you're going to see. And they have great customer service. They have the lowest price guarantee, event cancellation protection, job loss protection, and you can take the guesswork out of buying NBA tickets with Gametime. So download the Gametime app, create an account, use code LOCKEDONCollege for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, download the Gametime app, create an account, and redeem code LOCKEDONCOLLEGE for $20 off. Download Gametime today. Last minute tickets, lowest price guaranteed. So, are you watching Fox Sports or ESPN on your TV all day and you have to turn down the volume with all of that shouting? Make sure you can switch to Locked On Sports Today. It's a free 24/7 sports streaming channel program for you each and every single day to bring you the biggest stories without all of that screaming. Locked On Sports Today brings you can't miss analysis, opinions, and news, streaming 24/7 on YouTube or the free Amazon Fire TV channels app. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every single day. All right. So we have two more names on our top 5 list, and these are probably two names that definitely deserve to be on the list, but I guarantee you in the comments down below, they're going to ask, where's this guy? Where's this guy? And we're going to do an honorable mention after we get done. But number 4, we're going to go with a guy that was there when I was at Ole Miss, and that is Shay Hodge. Shay Hodge against Florida had a 86-yard touchdown pass from Jevon Sneed taken in a key game with Ole Miss winning that against Tim Tebow. Florida would win the national title, but they would lose to Ole Miss. Shay Hodge had a SportsCenter top 10 catch in the 2009 Egg Bowl. It was kind of big play after big play. The famous red pump game against Alabama, I guess that was in 2006. That was off of a completion to Shay Hodge when they ruled he stepped out of bounds before he caught the ball and all of that. Shay Hodge had a lot of big-time plays. Now, offense had not changed yet. It was still in the process of changing. Shay Hodge was in like the last generation of early wide receivers. Once it gets after that, you have Dante Moncrief, who came in like 2011, Laquan Treadwell, 2013. These bigger type wide receivers that got used by spread offenses came into vogue. Shay Hodge didn't have that. Ole Miss was still running a fullback in the I formation and running the wild rebel when he was in school. And yet, Shay Hodge is on the leaderboards in receptions, yards, touchdowns, all of that stuff. It goes all the way back. I remember him when he was on a recruiting visit, seeing him with then coordinator Noel Mazzoni and all of that. So I remember Shay Hodge and his recruitment and his college career quite well. Now, 5, we have Chris Collins. I've got to go with Chris Collins. Eli Manning's security blanket. I've got to go with him. He is just simply the first receiver that Ole Miss had that was dominant. Not NFL worthy because Willie Green made it to NFL. Pat Coleman had some games. Eddie Small had a game to where for 30 years or so, he was the single game receiving yard leader. Chris Collins, though, was the security blanket with Eli Manning. And because of that, when Chris Collins left, he owned just about every single record that Ole Miss had. He came to Ole Miss as a track guy, believe it or not. 100 meters, 200 meters out of South Mississippi, somewhere down there. He was a track guy that came in. But over time, he put on weight and got a little bit slower. And by the time he graduated from Ole Miss, he was a technician. And everybody remembers Derek Vandegrift talks about how slow Chris Collins was. He was talking about at the end when Chris was a technician, not at the beginning when he was a track guy. It's just a situation to where it didn't happen. He didn't have the NFL career that he could have had. But he will always be known as Eli Manning's security blanket. And he's a large reason why Eli Manning got drafted where he did. And he was a big role in the Ole Miss offense from, I guess, 99 to 2003 or 2002, somewhere in there. Really, really good wide receiver, and I enjoyed watching him. Now, the problem that I had personally, and this is not something that anybody is going to care about, is I was in the Navy during all of Eli Manning and Chris Collins during this era, which means like the 2002 and 2003 season, those 2 years, I had to watch every game 7 hours ahead of wherever it was being played. So if the game was an 8 o'clock kickoff, it didn't start until 3 a.m. in Italy. So I remember really late nights on broadcast.com because that was a thing back then. And watching games that are on AFN at 3 o'clock in the morning. And I was hoping and praying for the Jefferson Pilot game so I could watch it at 7 o'clock that night and get to bed at a normal hour. Luckily, Ole Miss was a 7-8 win team for the majority of that period, which means JP was not an issue for me. But it is really interesting indeed. Chris Collins, I really like. Now, other receivers, I don't want to, if I leave somebody out, I apologize. But like DK Metcalf, he could not make the top 5 list just because he was injured so much at Ole Miss. I think out of 36 or 37 games he could have played at Ole Miss, he played in like 18 or something like that. So that's worth keeping in mind with DK Metcalf. Pat Coleman in 1989, that team, he had a 200-yard game against Arkansas State. Jabari Small's dad, Eddie Small, had the receiving yardage record in the 90s. And then when you look at modern time receivers like Trey Harris, I didn't want to put a current receiver on the list because I think Trey Harris next year will likely be on the list if we're going to be honest about it. But this year he's not quite there. Elijah Moore, just really close. He couldn't nip out Chris Collins. I just went with Chris Collins instead of him. And you look at like Grant Hurd, if you look at Corey Peterson, Bill Flowers, friend of the program, Bill Flowers, who made big play after big play. These wide receivers, there's been so many that have come through Ole Miss. Ole Miss has always seemingly had a good wide receiver. Going back to Captain Michael Harmon, playing with John Forcade back in the early 80s and late 70s. Ole Miss has seemingly always had a wide receiver. J.R. Ambrose, to talk about him a little bit. Jermaine Kahn. Jermaine Kahn only played 1 year. One of my favorite players. Roel Preston. There's so many players that have come through Ole Miss that this list is going to be varied, and somebody is going to feel at least a little bit slighted. Mike Espy. I want to apologize to Mike Espy. Just forgot his name for a second. But yes, he is right on the cusp of making this list as well. Really, really interesting stuff. And I think that over the next couple of years, more can be added, especially when you look at the players that Ole Miss is looking at bringing in 2025 and beyond. So thanks for making the Locked On Ole Miss podcast your first listen every day. We're free and available wherever you get your podcast, including YouTube. We're part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every single day. Thanks, everybody. Hey, we got one more show. The What You Know episode is tomorrow morning, the Locked On Ole Miss podcast, and then we get into the weekend and enjoy what's going on. So take care, everyone. We'll talk to you later.